Let the games begin.
Hey there guys, Nordic Warrior here, welcome back to my video game review series. So those of you who have been following my channel will know that I quite recently made a long, in-depth retrospective review for the original Crash Bandicoot trilogy for the PS1, released in the mid to late 90s. As I mentioned in that video, the original Crash Bandicoot was most likely the first video game I ever played, and the very thing that made me want a PS1 in the first place, which was my first ever console. So needless to say, the Crash Bandicoot series means a lot to me on a personal level, and it induces a lot of nostalgia in me. I'll leave a link in the description section to that video for anyone who's interested. I'd appreciate it if you'd give it a watch. Also, before I go any further, feel free to hit the like button since it really helps the channel. And be sure to subscribe to the channel for more videos like this one. As those of you who saw the video will know, I mentioned that at some point I'd be looking at some of the sequels and spin-off games in the Crash series, and true to my word, we're going to be doing that now. The game we're going to be looking at today is another childhood favourite of mine, and a game that, despite being part of the Crash series, doesn't seem to get talked about much nowadays. Crash Bash, released in the year 2000, developed by Eurocom. On a side note, this is actually the first Crash game not to be developed by Naughty Dog, with Eurocom and Cerny Games instead taking the reins. So with the massive success of the original Crash trilogy, and with Crash at that point in time being basically the poster boy for the PlayStation console, it's only natural that Sony would want to milk the series for as long as possible, and in addition to the mainline Crash games, there were a few spin-offs here and there. These spin-offs usually deviated from the platforming genre, essentially being clones of other game genres featuring a Crash paint job. You had games like Crash Team Racing, which was essentially a Mario Kart clone. I will be reviewing that at some point, so stay tuned for that. And you of course had this game, Crash Bash. As I mentioned before, it's a childhood favourite of mine, and weirdly enough it used to be a Christmas tradition for me. Yet for some reason I always tended to play it on Christmas Eve. I'm not sure why, but I digress. The game is essentially a party game, featuring a whole bunch of competitive mini-games to take part in. The game is split up into 3 separate modes. First of all you have Adventure Mode, which is essentially the game's main story campaign. The story of the game is a very basic one. Aku Aku and his evil brother Uka Uka are attempting to settle their feud from the events of the previous games, when revealing that they're unable to fight each other due to some vague rule, they come up with the plan to host a tournament and have their allies compete for trophies. Sadly, when playing through the game for the purpose of this review, I noticed that the game's cutscenes were all messed up. This is likely because my disc is pretty badly scratched. Thankfully the game itself works fine, it's just that the audio in the cutscenes cuts in and out, and it doesn't often sync up with the footage. And sometimes the cutscenes just end prematurely. I thought I'd bring that up just in case anybody wonders why I'm not showing much footage from the cutscenes. Once the game begins, you're given a choice of 8 different characters from the previous Crash games. 4 of these are part of Aku Aku's team, which is the good team, and the other 4 are Uka Uka's team, which is the evil team. Meaning choosing from either team will help to determine the game's ending. The characters you get are of course Crash, his sister Coco, Tiny the Tiger, Dingo Dial, Dr. Neo Cortex, Dr. Nitrous Brio, Koala Kong, and a new character called Rilla Roo. Once you've chosen a character, you get transported to a warp room. Just like in Crash 2, the game's levels are separated by these warp rooms, each containing portals to each individual level, and just like in that game, you can choose whichever level you want in any order. As far as the levels themselves go, as I mentioned before, these are essentially mini-games. You play against 3 characters and attempt to win the game, which earns you a trophy. These trophies are the game's main collectible. Once you've collected all of them in a particular warp room, you gain access to that warp room's boss battle. More on that later. As far as the challenges in the levels go, there are 28 levels in total, with many of them being variations of the same challenge. This is something the game received a lot of criticisms for on its release, since it was accused of being essentially copy and paste. But I have my own feelings on that, I'll explain later. First of all, you have the Crash Ball challenges. These have the player take control of a hovercraft attached to a fixed line, where you have to defend a goal by deflecting metal balls away from it. And if truth be told, I found some of these challenges to be mostly luck based, since you never know where the balls are going to come from, and they often end up all over the place. They're really hectic and really raise your blood pressure. You also have the polar challenges, where each character will ride a polar bear, just like those levels in Crash 2. The goal here is to push your opponents off the edge of the arena, which can lead to some hilarious failures. What's cool about these levels too, is that you will often have a floating camera around the arena that will occasionally drop a beam, giving you access to a particular perk or hindrance. For example, you can collect a lightning bolt that shocks every other player, temporarily paralysing them, allowing you to attack them easily. There's even a small window of opportunity for you to take this power up off of an enemy, and of course enemies will try to take them off of you. There's even a weight that will take out whichever player gets a hold of it, giving them a limited amount of time to pass it on to another player instead. Again, this is very tense. You can also be shrunk, making you weaker and easier to push back, or enlarged, having the exact opposite effect, making you stronger. I enjoyed these levels a lot, they're very hectic and over the top. You have pogo stick challenges where each character rides a pogo stick, who would have thought, and the goal with these levels is to score as many points as possible by activating pressure tiles, and trying to link as many of them together as possible, before activating them by collecting crates. Just like with the polar levels, there are several pickups and perks such as being able to move faster or damaging an enemy and stunning them. You have crate crush levels, which are basically an all-out brawl. These are my personal favourite levels in the game. They have you basically spinning enemies or throwing crates and explosives at them. You can also collect useful items here such as the Aku Aku mask, that just like in previous games gives you an extra hit point, and Wumpa fruits which will replenish your health bar, as well as several others. Each of these levels will have their own power-ups. You can also strike certain blank crates and direct them towards enemies, tricking them into traps and hazards and things of that nature. You also have tank wars, which will have each player take control of a tank and simply blast the crap out of enemies before they do the same to you. These are very challenging, some of the most annoying levels in the game in my opinion, but I still had fun with them. And weirdly enough, the crystal and gem challenges in these levels are actually easier than the other levels, despite being generally harder to get the trophy in. More on the crystals and gems later. Later in the game you unlock racing levels, which basically have you race the other players in a circle. The challenge here is completing the circle without falling off the edge, or getting blown up by the other racers. You can pick up missiles and launch them at the other racers. These levels are really annoying because, like I said, you just go around in a circle, and if truth be told, the controls here are absolutely atrocious. And lastly you have Medieval Mayhem, which consists of a variety of challenges. I mentioned before that the repeating challenges gained the game a lot of criticism on its release, and to an extent I do agree with this, but to the game's credit, it's not like they just copied and pasted them. Each time a new level is introduced, a new gimmick or theme will also be included, and these do make the challenges of the same kind feel distinctly different from one another. For example, the second Crash Ball level gives you a magnet ability that allows you to grab a hold of one or more metal balls for a short time, allowing you to target them at an enemy's goal. The Bash levels add new environmental hazards from time to time, such as a penguin that can be interacted with, causing it to spin around and attack any player who gets in its way. One of the levels even has a destructible ground, which can cause players to fall, taking them out immediately. Some of them even have slow motion pickups and even prize crates that can offer you a Wumpa fruit or a particular type of weapon. The polar levels have some environmental challenges of their own. For example, in one of them, Uka Uka will be present and he will melt certain portions of the arena, giving the player less room to avoid falling off the edge. There's even one where the entire arena tilts and it's incredibly unstable. In one of them you can pick up a bomb and blast an enemy off his bear, making him more vulnerable to attacks. Launch a second bomb at that particular player and you can take them out immediately, meaning you don't even have to knock them over the edge. In my opinion, these gimmicks and changes do their bit to make the game feel more varied and less repetitive, and they help to make each level more memorable as a result. For example, if you're trying to avoid getting knocked off the edge by an enemy, and all of a sudden a massive fish jumps out the water, followed by a big ass walrus who almost topples you, that's some experience. What I like about the game's levels too is the Easter eggs, and callbacks to previous games, as well as the characters who make an appearance. For example, one of the Pogo levels has Ripperoo bouncing around the arena, leaving TNTs in your way as hazards to avoid. Same goes for N-Jin, who shows up in one of the Crash Ball levels. As a fan of the series, I really appreciate this. Also, the visual style and aesthetic of each level is reminiscent of levels from previous games. I mentioned before that completing a level gains you a trophy. In addition to trophies, there are also other collectibles for each level that will require you to re-enter them and complete a specific challenge. These collectibles are green gems, purple crystals, and relics. Naturally, with these being optional challenges, they are significantly more challenging, giving you some sort of hindrance or disadvantage in each challenge. For example, the Crash Ball levels force you to start with less hit points, and the Bash levels usually have an extra kind of environmental hazard, as well as a time limit for most of these challenges. Some of these are very challenging, but not impossible. If you want to 100% the game, then you will of course need to do them all, but yeah, it's entirely optional of course. Interestingly, the crystal challenges will even change the appearance of certain levels, adding more Easter eggs and stuff like that. I appreciate these. One thing that impresses me about the game in retrospect is the AI. It's surprisingly competent for the time, and presents a genuine challenge for the player. This is a pretty hard game actually, particularly the later levels, and the AI is the main cause of this, since your opponents will often outwit you, so be prepared for some trial and error. I mentioned before that the game has some boss battles, and these are pretty cool. Once you've obtained every single trophy in a warp room, before travelling to the next warp room you will need to defeat the next boss. The bosses are actually returning villains from previous games. For example, you once again take on Papu Papu, who was one of the early bosses in Crash 1, the Bearmanator and his giant tank, the Komodo Bros from Crash 2, and finally Nitrous Oxide from Crash Team Racing. The bosses are pretty challenging at first, but once you figure out the patterns you should be able to defeat them without too much trouble. I enjoyed them for the most part. Once you defeat Nitrous Oxide you gain access to a secret warp room in true Crash Bandicoot fashion. Here you get a whole bunch of bonus levels that can be unlocked by obtaining collectibles in the previous levels. So yeah, that pretty much sums up the adventure mode, which as I mentioned before is the game's main feature. The next mode the game has is battle mode. This essentially allows you to set up a quick match in any of the levels that have been unlocked via the adventure mode. So if you've already completed the game and just want to mess about with the game's challenges, then you can do this via this mode. You basically choose a player and can set up the terms for the battle. You can choose everyone for themselves in an all-out brawl, or a team battle which is 2-on-2. A pretty fun feature that adds some replay value. And finally you have the tournament mode, where you set up a short tournament featuring 4 consecutive minigames, and of course the player who wins the most minigames in the tournament will win the entire thing. It's pretty self-explanatory really, and I don't really have much more to say about these modes. As far as the graphics and presentation go, I'd say it looks pretty good for a game released in the year 2000, though nothing groundbreaking. The game uses a lot of graphical assets from previous Crash games, giving it an air of familiarity. If you enjoyed the previous games in the series, and you like the way that they look, then the visual aesthetic will probably appeal to you. One aspect of the presentation that couldn't have been any better in my opinion is the soundtrack. This game actually has one of the best soundtracks in the entire Crash series. Such an awesome soundtrack. Every single track in the game is so catchy, and suits the tone of each level perfectly. I particularly enjoyed the music in the tank levels. Even the warp room theme had me standing around for ages, singing along to it. One of my personal favourite video game soundtracks of all time. So yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say about Crash Bash. In retrospect, it's a relatively simple party game, and it's definitely one that's a lot better and more fun to play with friends. But then again, you could say that about a lot of games. I'm not gonna lie though, it's possible that my own childhood nostalgia makes the game more enjoyable for me than it would be for the next person, since as I mentioned before, it's relatively simple in what it has to offer. But sometimes that's all you want from a game. Games don't always have to be groundbreaking and innovative. Sometimes just wacky, good old-fashioned fun is all you need, and even looking at the game objectively, I actually think it's pretty underrated. While certainly not the best game in the Crash series, it's one of my personal favourite party games, and one that I go back to from time to time. And playing it again for the purpose of this review, I had a blast. I give Crash Bash a solid and well-deserved 8 out of 10. A great game and a childhood favourite of mine. Thanks for watching guys, I had an absolute blast replaying and reviewing Crash Bash. Once again, if you enjoyed the video, then remember to hit the like button since it really helps me. And be sure to subscribe to the channel for more videos just like this one. My apologies for the length of time it took me to get this video out. I've just been very busy with work as well as other stuff. And I do have several pretty large projects in the works for the channel, videos that will be much longer and much more detailed than this one. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section. Stay tuned for more retrospective video game reviews. Once again, I have a lot of reviews coming to the channel in the near future. Thanks for watching and God bless.